Tech billionaire invites caterer's daughter to play $1 million piano as a joke. He had no idea she'd silence the room. 9-year-old Anaya Washington stood in the corner of the glittering penthouse, her faded blue dress barely brushing her knees, her hands twitching to a rhythm only she could hear. Alistair Vance, Manhattan's most arrogant tech mogul, had just finished boasting about his handcrafted Italian Fazioli grand piano, a so-called monument to art, as he called it, when he turned to her and sneered, "I hear you like to play, little one. Why don't you give us a show?" The room erupted in snickers. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter rippled through the wealthy guests like a wave of champagne-fueled condescension. Her father, Marcus, a caterer in a starched uniform, froze mid-step, his tray of flutes trembling in his calloused hands. He had told Anaya to stay in the shadows. "This ain't our world, baby," he had whispered before the elevator doors opened. But when Vance's taunt echoed across the marble floor, when all eyes turned to the little black girl hiding behind a gilded column, something in Anaya's chest stirred. Not fear, but music. And when she sat down at that $1 million piano, she didn't just play the notes. She told a story that no one in that penthouse would ever forget. The Manhattan skyline glittered like a jagged crown, its spires piercing the velvet night. From the penthouse atop the Vanguard Tower, the city sprawled below, a constellation of ambition and excess. Inside, the air shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic flecks across polished marble floors, and the clink of champagne flutes wove through the soft hum of a jazz quartet. At the heart of the room stood a Fazioli grand piano, its ebony curves gleaming under a dedicated spotlight, less an instrument than a monument to extravagance. The guests, draped in silk and tailored suits, orbited it like moths to a flame, their laughter sharp and practiced. Anaya Washington, 9 years old, stood in the shadow of a gilded column, her small frame swallowed by the grandeur. Her faded blue dress, ironed to crisp perfection by her father's careful hands, hung slightly too large on her shoulders. Her braids, tightly woven, framed a face that seemed too still for a child, her wide brown eyes drinking in the scene. Her fingers twitched at her sides, not from nerves but from a restless ache, a silent rhythm only she could hear. She glanced at the Fazioli, its keys beckoning like a forbidden dream. Her chest tightened, not with fear but with a longing so fierce it felt like a heartbeat of its own. Her father, Marcus Washington, moved through the crowd with a tray of canapes, his black catering uniform starched and immaculate. His broad shoulders stooped slightly, a habit born of years navigating spaces where he was meant to be invisible. Anaya watched him, her gaze tracing the lines of worry etched into his face. He told her to stay quiet, to blend into the background. "This ain't our world, baby," he'd whispered in the elevator, his voice heavy with something Anaya couldn't name. She'd nodded, but her eyes had strayed to the piano even then, its presence pulling at her like gravity. Alistair Vance, the evening's host, held court near the piano, his silver hair catching the light as he gestured expansively. At 50, he exuded the confidence of a man who'd built an empire on code and cunning. His tailored tuxedo fit like armor, and his smile was a blade, sharp and deliberate. "This Fazioli," he announced to a cluster of admirers, his voice booming over the chatter, "was handcrafted in Italy. Cost more than most people's homes. A work of art, not just a piano." He paused, letting the words sink in, relishing the murmurs of awe. Anaya's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't care about the price. She wanted to know how it sounded. Her mind drifted to the battered upright piano in the basement of St. Luke's Church, where Sister Clara had taught her to play. The keys were chipped, the pedals creaky, but every Sunday after service, Anaya would sit there, coaxing melodies from its worn heart. Bach's Prelude in C major had been her first love, its steady pulse like a conversation with something bigger than herself. Sister Clara had called her a prodigy, her small hands a miracle. But miracles didn't pay bills, and the church piano was a world away from this glittering cage. Anaya's gaze flickered back to her father. He was offering a tray to a woman in a sequin gown, his smile polite but strained. The woman barely glanced at him, her fingers snatching a shrimp puff as she turned back to her conversation. Anaya's stomach twisted, a knot of anger and shame she couldn't untangle. She wanted to run to him, to tell him he didn't need to bow his head. But she stayed still, her fingers curling into fists, the rhythm in her chest growing louder, insistent. Vance's voice cut through her thoughts. Art is about power, he was saying, his hand resting possessively on the Fazioli's lid. You don't just play a piece, you own it. His audience nodded, their faces a mask of agreement, though Anaya caught a flicker of boredom in one man's eyes. She wondered if anyone here cared about music the way she did, if they felt it like a pulse in their bones. Her eyes drifted to the piano again, imagining her fingers on those flawless keys, the notes rising like a prayer. Her heart raced, a wild staccato, and she pressed her back against the column, afraid the longing might spill out of her. A sudden clatter broke her reverie. A guest, swaying slightly from too much champagne, bumped into Marcus, sending a glass of red wine tumbling. It shattered on the marble, a crimson stain spreading like blood. The room paused, heads turning. Marcus dropped to his knees, muttering apologies as he dabbed at the mess with a napkin. Anaya's breath caught, her body tensing as if she could shield him from the stares. The guest waved him off, laughing too loudly. No harm done, my man, he said, but his tone was patronizing, dismissive. Anaya's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She never cried, not since Mama left. Instead, she looked at the Fazioli, its spotlight a halo in the dim room. She whispered to herself, so soft no one could hear. One day I'll play you. I'll make them listen. Her father glanced up, catching her eye. His face softened, but his voice was firm as he beckoned her over. Anaya, stay close, he said, his tone laced with worry. She nodded, stepping toward him, but her gaze lingered on the piano, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. As Marcus resumed his work, Anaya felt the weight of the room pressing in. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the shallow chatter. She was invisible here, a shadow in a world of light. But the rhythm in her chest didn't falter. It was steady, unyielding, a melody waiting to break free. She didn't know how, but she knew one thing. This piano, this night, would change everything. The penthouse pulsed with a restless energy, the jazz quartet's notes weaving through the chatter like a thin thread holding the night together. Anaya stood close to her father, her small hand brushing against his, seeking the familiar warmth of his calloused fingers. The wine spill had been cleaned, the broken glass swept away, but the sting of the guest's laughter lingered in her chest, sharp as a splinter. She kept her eyes down, tracing the veins in the marble floor, trying to drown out the hum of voices that made her feel smaller than she was. But the Fazioli piano loomed in her peripheral vision, its spotlight a beacon she couldn't ignore. Her fingers twitched again, tapping a silent rhythm against her thigh, a melody she'd played 100 times in her mind. Alistair Vance's voice sliced through the din, commanding the room with the ease of a conductor. He stood by the piano, a glass of bourbon in one hand, his other resting possessively on the Fazioli's polished lid. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his tone rich with self-assurance, this instrument isn't just a piano. It's a legacy, crafted by masters, played by virtuosos. His eyes swept the crowd, basking in their nods. But then they landed on Anaya. Her breath hitched. She felt the weight of his gaze like a spotlight pinning her in place, her heart thudding a frantic allegro. You there? Vance called, his voice carrying a mocking lilt. The little girl in the corner. You're Marcus's daughter, aren't you? He gestured toward her father, who froze mid-step, a tray of champagne flutes trembling in his hands. The room turned, heads swiveling, their curiosity a palpable force. Anaya's cheeks burned, but she didn't move, her body rooted as if the marble had claimed her feet. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows, but the rhythm in her chest wouldn't let her. It pulsed louder, defiant. Marcus cleared his throat, stepping forward. Mr. Vance, sir, she's just... He began, his voice low, apologetic. But Vance cut him off with a wave of his hand. Oh, come now, Marcus, Vance said, his smile sharp as glass. I heard you talking to one of the staff. You said your girl's got a knack for the piano, didn't you? A little prodigy, maybe? His words dripped with condescension, each syllable a jab. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, soft but cruel, like the rustle of silk. Anaya's fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She hated how they looked at her father, like he was nothing more than the help. And now they were looking at her the same way. Vance leaned against the piano, his bourbon glass glinting in the light. "Come on, little one," he said, beckoning her with a theatrical flourish. "Why don't you give us a show? Play something on this million-dollar beauty. It's not every day a kid like you gets to touch something this fine." The word kid landed like a slap, and the laughter grew louder. A few guests exchanging amused glances. A woman in a ruby-red dress whispered to her companion, "What's she going to play? Mary Had a Little Lamb?" The room seemed to tilt, the air heavy with expectation and mockery. Anaya's throat tightened, her breath shallow. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, urging her to stay put. His eyes, wide with panic, pleaded silently, "Don't do this, baby." But beneath the fear, she saw something else. Shame, not for her, but for himself, for bringing her into this world of wolves. Her heart twisted, the rhythm inside her shifting from a melody to a drum beat, fierce and unyielding. She wasn't just Anaya, the caterer's daughter. She was the girl who'd spent hours at St. Luke's, her small hands coaxing magic from a broken piano. She was the girl who dreamed in arpeggios, who felt music like a second skin. "Sir," Marcus tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's only 9. She doesn't—" "Nonsense!" Vance interrupted, his grin widening. "Let's give her a chance to shine. Or are you worried she'll embarrass you?" He turned to the crowd, raising his glass. "What do you say, folks? Shall we let the little lady try her luck?" A chorus of chuckles and half-hearted claps answered him, the sound grating against Anaya's ears. She glanced at the Fazioli, its keys gleaming like a challenge. Her fingers ached to touch them, to prove she was more than their laughter, more than their pity. Marcus squeezed her shoulder, his voice a desperate hiss. "Anaya, you don't have to. Let's go." But she shook her head, so slight he might have missed it. Her eyes locked on the piano, and for a moment the room faded. The laughter, the stares, even her father's fear. All she saw was the instrument, its promise whispering to her soul. She took a step forward, then another, her worn sneakers silent against the marble. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something fiercer, something that felt like fire. "All right then," Vance said, stepping aside with a mock bow. "The stage is yours, little prodigy." His tone was a dare, his eyes glinting with amusement. Anaya stopped in front of the piano, her small frame dwarfed by its grandeur. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing, just feeling their cool smoothness. The room's laughter faded to a hush, replaced by a tense curiosity. Her chest rose and fell, the rhythm inside her steadying, like a metronome finding its tempo. She didn't look at Vance or the crowd. She looked at the keys, and in that moment, they were her world. The penthouse held its breath, the air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of champagne. Anaya stood before the Fazioli, its ebony expanse stretching before her like a frozen sea. Her small hands hovered over the keys, trembling not from fear but from the weight of 1,000 silent rehearsals in the dim basement of St. Luke's Church. The crowd's murmurs faded to a low hum, their eyes pinning her like needles. She could feel her father's gaze from the corner, heavy with worry, and Alistair Vance's smug smirk burning into her back. But none of it mattered. The piano was her anchor, its keys a language she spoke better than words. Her chest tightened, the rhythm inside her, a pulse that had been her companion since she first touched a piano, quickening to a steady allegro. She closed her eyes, shutting out the glittering room, the mocking laughter from moments before. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw Sister Clara's weathered hands guiding hers over chipped keys, heard her voice, "Play what's true, Anaya. The music's in your bones." Her fingers settled on the cool ivory, and for a moment, she was no longer a 9-year-old in a borrowed dress. She was a force, a melody waiting to unfurl. Anaya pressed the first note, a single C, clean and clear, ringing through the silence like a bell. She chose Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, a piece she'd played so often it lived in her muscles. It was simple yet demanding, a cascade of arpeggios that required precision over flash. Her fingers moved with a quiet confidence, each note falling into place with mechanical perfection. The music flowed, steady and unyielding, like water carving through stone. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't dare glance at Vance or her father. The piano was her world now, its resonance vibrating through her small frame, grounding her. The room shifted. The soft chuckles that had lingered from Vance's taunts died away, replaced by a hush so profound it seemed the chandeliers themselves held their breath. Anaya's hands danced across the keys, her tiny fingers navigating the complex runs with an ease that belied her age. She played without error, each chord crisp, each phrase deliberate, but there was something restrained in her touch, a deliberate withholding. She wasn't playing to dazzle, she was playing to prove. The notes were a shield, a declaration. I am not your joke. Her heart pounded, a counterpoint to the music. She could feel the weight of their stares, the surprise rippling through the crowd. She imagined their thoughts. How does a child like her know this? And the rhythm in her chest flared, a spark of defiance. She wanted to pour herself into the keys, to let the music sing the way it did in her dreams. But she held back. Not yet. This was survival, not surrender. Her fingers pressed harder, the final measures of the prelude building to a quiet crescendo, each note a step toward reclaiming her place in this room. As the last chord faded, the silence was deafening, a vacuum where laughter had once been. Anaya lifted her hands from the keys, her breath shallow, her body trembling with the effort of holding herself together. She opened her eyes, the room swimming back into focus. The guests stared, some with mouths slightly agape, others leaning forward, as if drawn by an invisible thread. A man in a velvet jacket blinked rapidly, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. A woman near the back clutched her necklace, her lips parted in awe. Marcus stood frozen in the corner, his tray still in hand, his eyes glistening with something fiercer than pride. Anaya felt it too, a warmth spreading through her chest, but it was tangled with fear. She'd done what they asked, but at what cost? Her gaze flicked to Vance, who stood near the piano, his smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. He clapped slowly, the sound sharp and solitary, breaking the spell. Well, he said, his voice tight, not bad for a beginner. A bit mechanical, but what can you expect from a child? The words were meant to sting, but they lacked conviction, and a few guests exchanged skeptical glances. Anaya's fingers curled at her sides, the rhythm in her chest stuttering. Mechanical. The word cut deeper than she'd expected, echoing the doubts she'd buried long ago. Sister Clara had warned her. Some folks'll never hear the music, only the notes. She wanted to argue, to tell Vance he was wrong, but her throat was dry, her voice too small for this room. Instead, she stood, her small frame straight as a reed, and gave a slight nod, the way Sister Clara had taught her to end a performance. Polite, but not submissive. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of admiration and disbelief. A man near the front whispered to his companion, "She's 9?" The woman in the ruby-red dress from earlier, who'd mocked Anaya minutes ago, now looked away, her cheeks flushed. Marcus stepped forward, his tray set aside, and placed a hand on Anaya's shoulder. His touch was steady, but his eyes were a storm of emotions. Relief, fear, and something new, something like awe. "Come on, baby," he whispered, guiding her back to the corner. Anaya's heart still raced, the rhythm inside her unsettled. She'd played perfectly, but it wasn't enough. Not for her. The music she'd held back, the story she hadn't told, burned in her chest like a caged bird. She glanced at the Fazioli, its keys still warm from her touch, and felt a pull stronger than fear. She wasn't done. Not yet. Vance's voice broke through again, louder now, reclaiming the room. "Let's have some real music, shall we?" he said, his tone forced, his eyes avoiding hers. But Anaya knew something had shifted, a crack in the foundation of his world. And in that crack, she felt the first stirrings of her own. The penthouse buzzed with a restless undercurrent, the air still charged from Anaya's prelude. The Fazioli stood like a silent judge, its spotlight casting long shadows across the marble floor. Anaya lingered near her father, Marcus, her small frame pressed against his side, her fingers still tingling from the keys. The rhythm in her chest hadn't settled. It thrummed unevenly, caught between pride and a gnawing hunger. She'd played perfectly, silenced their laughter. But the word mechanical, Vance's barb, clung to her like damp cloth. She wanted more than precision. She wanted to make them feel. Alistair Vance paced near the piano, his bourbon glass empty now, clutched tightly in his hand. His silver hair gleamed, but his smile was strained, a crack in his polished facade. Anaya's performance had shifted something in the room, and he felt it. The guests' whispers, their glances darting between him and the 9-year-old who'd stolen his stage. His jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He clapped his hands sharply, the sound cutting through the murmurs like a whip. "Well, that was charming," he said, his voice loud, performative. "But let's show you what real music looks like, shall we?" The crowd stirred, their attention snapping back to him. Anaya's stomach twisted, not with fear, but with a quiet defiance. She watched Vance stride to the piano, his movements deliberate, like a king reclaiming his throne. Her father's hand tightened on her shoulder, his breath uneven. "Stay quiet, baby," he whispered, but his voice trembled as if he sensed the storm brewing. Anaya nodded, her eyes fixed on Vance. She didn't trust his smile, didn't trust the way he looked at her, like she was a puzzle he needed to break. Vance settled onto the piano bench, his posture rigid, his fingers flexing with theatrical flair. "Chopin," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a proclamation. "Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, a piece that demands soul, not just skill." The words were aimed at Anaya, a challenge wrapped in velvet. She felt them land, heavy as stones, but she didn't flinch. Her heart beat faster, the rhythm in her chest shifting to a slower, deeper pulse, like a drum waiting for its moment. He began to play, his hands descending on the keys with force. The opening notes of the nocturne unfurled, rich and melodic, but there was something aggressive in his touch. He leaned into the phrases, his fingers hammering the forte passages, his head tilting dramatically as if lost in the music. The notes were correct, the chords precise, but the performance felt like a spectacle, a display of power rather than passion. The piano's resonance filled the room, but it was hollow like a beautiful shell with nothing inside. Anaya tilted her head, listening not just to the notes, but to what was missing. Where was the longing, the ache that Chopin wove into every measure? She felt it in her own chest, but Vance's hands seemed deaf to it. The guests watched, their faces a mix of polite admiration and subtle discomfort. A man near the bar shifted his weight, his eyes drifting to his watch. A woman in a sapphire gown fanned herself, her smile fixed but strained. Anaya's fingers twitched, tracing invisible keys against her dress. She knew this piece. Sister Clara had played it for her once, her voice soft as she explained. "It's like a love letter to the night, Anaya. You have to whisper it." Vance wasn't whispering. He was shouting, demanding the room's awe, and the room was giving it, but reluctantly. Her mind wandered to St. Luke's, to the nights she'd snuck into the basement after lessons, playing until her fingers ached. She'd imagined herself on a stage like this, not to prove anything, but to share the music that lived inside her. Now watching Vance, she felt a pang of disappointment, not for herself, but for the piano. It deserved better. Her chest tightened, the rhythm inside her swelling, urging her to answer his challenge. But she stayed still, her small frame a shadow against her father's side, her eyes burning with a fire she wasn't ready to unleash. Vance reached the nocturne's climax, his hands sweeping across the keys in a flourish that bordered on violence. The final notes rang out, bold and commanding, and he rose from the bench, arms outstretched, as if expecting a standing ovation. The applause came, but it was tepid, a scattering of claps that felt more like obligation than enthusiasm. A few guests nodded politely, but their eyes wandered, some to Anaya, others to the floor. Vance's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered, bowing with exaggerated grace. "That," he said, turning to the crowd, "is how you play with soul." Anaya's lips parted, a breath escaping her. Soul! She wanted to laugh, to cry, to run to the piano and show him what soul really meant. The rhythm in her chest was a storm now, wild and uncontained, but she pressed her hands against her sides, forcing it down. She caught her father's eye, saw the relief in his expression, but also the fear. He thought this was over, that they could slip away unnoticed. But Anaya felt the room's energy, the way the guests' glances lingered on her, waiting for something more. Vance turned to her, his smile sharp as a blade. "Well, little prodigy," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Think you can top that?" The crowd tittered, a few chuckles breaking the silence. Anaya's heart pounded, her fingers itching to answer. She saw the Fazioli, its keys gleaming like a promise, and the rhythm inside her surged, a melody she couldn't ignore. Her father's hand tightened, a silent plea, but her eyes were on the piano, her resolve hardening like steel. She took a step forward, her sneakers silent on the marble. The room seemed to tilt, the air heavy with expectation. She didn't know what she'd play, didn't know if she could face their laughter again. But she knew one thing. The music inside her was bigger than this room, bigger than Vance, bigger than her fear. And it was ready to speak. The penthouse seemed to hold its breath, the air taut as a bowstring. Anaya stood before the Fazioli, its ebony surface reflecting the chandelier's fractured light like stars caught in a still lake. Her small hands trembled, not from fear but from the storm raging inside her. A rhythm that had been a whisper in her chest now roared like a river breaking free. Alistair Vance's challenge hung in the air, his mocking words, "Think you can top that?" still echoing, sharp as a blade. The crowd's eyes pinned her, a mix of curiosity and skepticism, their murmurs a low hum beneath the pounding of her heart. Her father, Marcus, stood frozen in the corner, his face a mask of dread, his hand half raised as if to pull her back. But Anaya's gaze was fixed on the piano, its keys a lifeline in a sea of judgment. She slid onto the bench, her faded dress brushing against the polished wood, her sneakers barely touching the floor. The room tilted, the spotlight's heat prickling her skin. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a moment, doubt clawed at her, a voice whispering she was too small, too young, too out of place. But then she thought of St. Luke's, of Sister Clara's voice. "Play what's true, Anaya." She thought of her father, his bowed head, his silent sacrifices. The rhythm in her chest surged, no longer a metronome but a heartbeat, wild and alive. She pressed her hands to the keys, the cool ivory grounding her, and began. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, the same piece Vance had played, a deliberate echo. The first notes spilled out, soft and deliberate, mirroring his opening phrases. Vance's smirk widened, his arms crossed as if to say, "See? Just a copy." The crowd leaned forward, expecting a repeat of his performance. But Anaya's hands moved with a different intent. Where Vance had hammered, she caressed, her fingers coaxing a melody that sighed rather than shouted. The notes were liquid, flowing with a tenderness that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. Her shoulders swayed slightly, her eyes half closed, as if she were speaking to the piano, not the crowd. Inside her, the music was a story, her story. The soft chords held the ache of her father's long shifts, the weight of their tiny apartment with its peeling paint. The rising melody carried her dreams, the ones she whispered to herself at night, of stages and spotlights. Her fingers danced, lighter now, weaving a thread of hope through the nocturne's longing. The crowd's murmurs faded, their faces softening, some closing their eyes as if to chase the sound. Anaya felt their shift, but she didn't play for them. She played for the girl she was, the girl she wanted to be. Then at the piece's heart, she broke free. Her fingers strayed from Chopin's score, slipping into a new rhythm, a syncopated pulse that echoed the jazz and blues she'd heard in her father's old records, the ones he played when he thought she was asleep. The nocturne transformed, its classical elegance melding with a soulful cadence, a defiant celebration of her roots. The chords grew richer, layered with minor notes that spoke of struggle, then lifted with bright arpeggios that sang of resilience. Her improvisation was a tapestry, weaving Chopin's romance with the heartbeat of Harlem, the cry of her people's history. Her small frame leaned into the keys, her braids swaying, her face alight with a fire that burned brighter than the chandelier above. The room was spellbound, A woman in a sapphire gown clutched her husband's arm, her breath catching. A man near the bar set down his glass, his eyes wide as if seeing Anaya for the first time. Marcus stood rigid, his hands clenched, tears brimming but unspoken. His little girl, his quiet shadow, was no longer invisible. She was a force, her music a tide pulling everyone in its wake. Vance's smirk had vanished, his face pale, his bourbon glass forgotten on a nearby table. His eyes narrowed, but he couldn't look away, caught in the spell of a 9-year-old who turned his challenge into a mirror. Anaya's fingers slowed, the final notes of her improvisation lingering like a sigh. The last chord hung in the air, soft but resolute, a full stop to her story. She lifted her hands, her chest heaving, the rhythm inside her quiet now, satisfied. The silence that followed was profound, a sacred pause that held the room captive. Then, like a dam breaking, applause erupted, fierce, unscripted, a thunder that shook the chandeliers. Guests stood, clapping with a fervor that drowned out their earlier laughter. Anaya's cheeks flushed, her breath shaky, but she didn't smile. She felt exposed, raw, as if she'd given the room a piece of her soul. Vance clapped too, but his hands moved slowly, his face a mask of forced composure. "Impressive," he said, his voice tight, barely audible over the applause. "For a child." The words were meant to dismiss, but they fell flat, swallowed by the crowd's fervor. Anaya glanced at him, her eyes steady, unafraid. She saw the crack in his armor, the flicker of doubt in his gaze. Her heart swelled, not with triumph, but with clarity. She hadn't played to beat him. She'd played to be heard. Marcus stepped forward, his hand finding hers, his touch trembling but proud. "You did good, baby," he whispered, his voice thick. Anaya nodded, her small hand squeezing his, but her eyes drifted back to the Fazioli. The rhythm in her chest was calm now, but it wasn't gone. It was waiting, ready for the next song, the next stage. She'd spoken tonight, and the world had listened. But she knew deep down this was only the beginning. The final note of Anaya's performance lingered in the penthouse, like a breath held too long, its echo swallowed by a silence so profound it seemed to still the very air. The Fazioli stood sentinel, its keys still warm from her touch, while the chandelier's light cast a halo around her small frame. Anaya sat frozen on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The rhythm in her heart, that wild pulse that had carried her through the music, was quiet now, but it left a tremor in her bones, a feeling both exhilarating and terrifying, as if she'd bared her soul to a room of strangers. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, flicked to the crowd, searching for her father, for something to anchor her. Then the silence shattered. Applause erupted, a tidal wave of sound that shook the room, raw and unrestrained. Guests leapt to their feet, their claps echoing off the marble walls, their faces alight with awe. A woman in a sapphire gown pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes glistening. A man near the bar shouted, "Bravo!" his voice hoarse with enthusiasm. Anaya's cheeks burned, her small body shrinking under the weight of their admiration. She'd wanted them to hear her, but this roar of approval, was overwhelming, a spotlight too bright for a girl used to shadows. Marcus stood in the corner, his catering tray forgotten on a table, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles paled. His eyes, wet with unshed tears, locked on his daughter, and for a moment Anaya saw not just pride, but a flicker of disbelief, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Her heart twisted, a pang of love and guilt. She defied his whispered pleas to stay quiet, to stay safe, but she'd done it for him too, for the man who'd carried her through a world that tried to make them small. She slid off the bench, her sneakers silent on the floor, and took a tentative step toward him, her braids swaying like a metronome. Alistair Vance stood near the piano, his face a mask of porcelain, his bourbon glass long abandoned. The applause seemed to strike him like blows, each clap a reminder of his own hollow performance. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting from Anaya to the crowd, searching for a way to reclaim his stage. "Well," he said, his voice cutting through the fading applause, sharp but unsteady, "that was creative. But let's be honest, That wasn't Chopin. You can't just rewrite a master's work, child. His words aimed to wound, to reassert his dominance, but they fell flat, drowned by the crowd's lingering fervor. A few guests frowned, their murmurs turning critical, not of Anaya, but of him. Anaya's fingers curled at her sides, the rhythm in her chest stirring again, a quiet defiance. She met Vance's gaze, her brown eyes steady, unflinching. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear, carrying the weight of a truth she'd always known. "You played the notes, Mr. Vance," she said, her words slicing through the room's hum. "I played a story." The simplicity of it, the unyielding honesty of a 9-year-old, struck like a chord. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a few stifled laughs, not mocking but delighted, as if she'd named a truth they all felt. Vance's face flushed, his lips parting, but no retort came. For the first time, he was speechless. Before the moment could settle, a figure emerged from the crowd. A woman, older, her gray hair swept into an elegant bun, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the room's opulence. She moved with a quiet authority, her eyes sharp but kind. The guests parted for her, their whispers trailing in her wake. She stopped before Anaya, her presence commanding yet gentle. "My name is Eleanor Price," she said, her voice low, resonant. "I'm with Juilliard's pre-college program." She knelt slightly, meeting Anaya's eyes at her level. "What you did tonight wasn't just playing. It was art, the kind we don't see often." Anaya's breath caught, her heart stumbling. Juilliard. The word was a myth, a distant star she'd only heard in Sister Clara's stories. She glanced at her father, saw his eyes widen, his hand trembling as he reached for her. Eleanor handed Marcus a card, her fingers steady. "I'd like to arrange an audition," she said. "This child belongs on a bigger stage." Marcus nodded, his voice lost, his fingers closing around the card as if it were a lifeline. The crowd buzzed, their whispers now a chorus of wonder. "Juilliard," one guest murmured. "She's only a child," said another, but their tones held reverence, not doubt. Anaya felt their eyes, not as needles now, but as a warm light lifting her. Yet inside she was a storm of emotions. Pride, fear, a longing she couldn't name. She'd poured her heart into the keys and they'd heard her. But what did it mean? Would this moment change her, change her father, change the world that had always kept them at its edges? Vance cleared his throat, stepping forward, his voice strained. "Very generous of you, Eleanor," he said, forcing a smile. "But let's not get carried away. She's talented, sure, but—" His words were cut off by a guest's sharp cough, a signal of disapproval. The room's allegiance had shifted, and Vance felt it, his shoulders stiffening. He turned away, retreating to the bar, his silhouette diminished against the glittering skyline. Anaya clung to her father's hand, her small fingers tight around his. The rhythm in her chest was soft now, a lullaby, but it carried a new note, a promise. She'd spoken through the piano, and the world had answered. As Marcus led her toward the exit, his touch gentle but fierce, she glanced back at the Fazioli, its keys a silent vow. She wasn't done singing. The penthouse, once a glittering stage, felt hollow now, its grandeur dimmed by the echo of Anaya's music. The Fazioli stood silent, its spotlight casting a cold glow across the marble floor, a monument to a night that had shifted the room's axis. Anaya clung to her father's hand, her small fingers laced tightly with his, her heart still racing from the applause that had shaken her world. The rhythm in her chest was softer now, a gentle pulse, but it carried a new weight, a mix of triumph and uncertainty, like a melody half-written. She glanced up at Marcus, his face a map of emotions she couldn't fully read. Pride, fear, and something deeper, something like hope. The crowd's murmurs swirled around them, a tide of whispers that made her feel both seen and exposed. Guests began to drift toward the exit, their silk dresses and tailored suits rustling like leaves in a fading storm. Their eyes lingered on Anaya, not with mockery now, but with a quiet reverence, as if she'd become a story they'd tell tomorrow. A woman in a sapphire gown paused to nod at Marcus, her smile genuine, almost apologetic. A man in a velvet jacket murmured to his companion, "That girl's going places," his voice low but certain. Anaya's cheeks warmed, her free hand tugging at her faded dress. the weight of their gazes pressing against her. She'd wanted to be heard, but this attention felt like a spotlight she wasn't ready to stand in. Alistair Vance stood alone near the bar, his silver hair disheveled, his bourbon glass refilled but untouched. The crowd's warmth had turned cold, their farewells to him curt, their nods perfunctory. He'd built this night to showcase his power, his taste, his invincibility. But it had unraveled in the hands of a 9-year-old. His eyes darted to the Fazioli, its presence now a rebuke, a reminder of his hollow notes against her living melody. He forced a laugh, loud enough to draw a few glances, but it was brittle, like glass on the verge of cracking. Quite a show, wasn't it? He called to no one in particular, but the room ignored him. Its allegiance shifted to the girl in the corner. Anaya felt his gaze sharp and resentful, but she didn't look back. Her chest tightened, not with fear but with a quiet resolve. She'd spoken through the piano, and he'd heard her, whether he admitted it or not. The rhythm in her heart stirred, a soft echo of the jazz and blues she'd woven into Chopin, a reminder of who she was. She thought of her father's old records, the ones he played late at night, their soulful strains filling their tiny apartment. Those sounds were her roots, her strength, and she'd carried them into this glittering cage, making it her own. Marcus knelt beside her, his catering uniform creased from the long night, his eyes searching hers. "You okay, baby?" he asked, his voice low, rough with emotion. Anaya nodded, but her throat was tight, words too heavy to form. She saw the card in his hand, Eleanor Price's, from Juilliard, and felt a spark of something new, something like possibility. But it was tangled with fear. What did it mean to step into a world like that? A world so far from St. Luke's, from their cramped kitchen table where she practiced scales on a paper keyboard. Her fingers twitched, longing for the piano's keys, for the certainty they gave her. "We should go," Marcus said, standing, his hand guiding her toward the service elevator. Anaya followed, her sneakers silent against the marble, but her eyes lingered on the Fazioli one last time. It stood alone now, its spotlight dimming as the staff began to clear the room. She imagined its keys under her fingers, the way they'd sung for her, and a small smile curved her lips. She'd made them listen. For one night, she'd been more than the caterer's daughter. In the elevator, the hum of the descent was a stark contrast to the penthouse's clamor. Marcus was silent, his hand still holding hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Anaya leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, the rhythm in her chest syncing with his steady breathing. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm proud of you, Anaya. So proud." His words cracked, and she felt the tremor in his hand, the weight of years spent shielding her from a world that rarely saw them. She squeezed his fingers, her heart swelling with a love too big for words. As they stepped into the cold night, the Manhattan skyline loomed above, its lights indifferent. Anaya's breath fogged in the air, her faded dress no match for the chill, but she felt warm inside, as if the music had left a fire in her bones. Marcus pulled her close, his arm a shield against the city's vastness. "You did something tonight," he said, his voice stronger now. "Something they won't forget." Anaya looked up at him, her eyes bright despite the darkness. "I just wanted you to be proud," she whispered, her voice small but fierce. They boarded the subway, the car rattling through the tunnels, its fluorescent lights harsh against their tired faces. Anaya clutched the Juilliard card, now tucked in her father's pocket, her mind racing with questions she couldn't voice. Would they call? Could she belong in a place like that? The rhythm in her chest stirred again, a melody waiting to be played. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing. She'd found her voice, and it was louder than she'd ever dreamed. A year had passed since the Penthouse Gala, but its echo lingered in Anaya's bones, a rhythm that had reshaped her world. The stage of Carnegie Hall stretched before her now, its polished wood gleaming under the spotlights, its vast auditorium a sea of expectant faces. At 10 years old, Anaya stood at its edge, her new black dress fitting perfectly, her braids adorned with a single ribbon. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers twitching with a familiar ache, the same pulse that had carried her through that night in Alistair Vance's tower. The rhythm in her chest was steady now, Not a storm, but a song, confident and clear. Yet beneath it, a whisper of doubt lingered. Could she belong here, in this hallowed hall, so far from St. Luke's chipped keys? The auditorium buzzed softly, the audience settling into their velvet seats. Anaya's eyes found her father, Marcus, in the front row, his catering uniform replaced by a borrowed suit, his face alight with a pride that made her heart ache. Beside him sat Sister Clara, her weathered hands folded, her smile a beacon in the dim light. Anaya's breath hitched, the weight of their belief pressing against her. She'd earned a full scholarship to Juilliard's pre-college program, a dream sparked by Eleanor Price's card that night. Months of auditions, lessons, and late-night practices on a lone piano had led to this moment. Her debut, performing a sonata she'd composed, a blend of classical precision and the soulful strains of her roots. Backstage, she'd overheard whispers, the prodigy from Harlem, the girl who humbled Vance. The story of that night had spread, amplified by a guest viral post, turning Anaya into a quiet legend. But fame was a strange weight for a 10-year-old. She didn't want to be a story. She wanted to be the music itself. Her fingers brushed the air, tracing invisible keys, and the rhythm in her chest swelled. A melody that held her father's sacrifices, her mother's absence, the grit of their old apartment. This stage was hers, not because of Vance or the gala, but because she'd fought for it. Across town, Alistair Vance's world had dimmed. His penthouse, once a beacon of influence, now hosted sparse gatherings, the Fazioli gathering dust under its velvet cover. The elite who'd once flocked to his galas now spoke of him in hushed, pitying tones. At a recent art auction, Anaya overheard two former guests, faces she vaguely recalled from that night, discussing him over champagne. "Vance, he's a laughingstock now," one said, swirling her glass. "Tried to outplay a child and lost his shine." The other chuckled, shaking his head. "That piano's a relic of his ego. He won't touch it anymore." Anaya had turned away, her heart unmoved. Vance's fall wasn't her victory. Her music was. On stage, the house lights dimmed and a hush fell over Carnegie Hall. Anaya stepped forward, her sneakers traded for polished shoes that clicked softly against the wood. She settled at the grand piano, its keys gleaming like a promise kept. Her fingers rested lightly, the cool ivory familiar. A friend. She closed her eyes and the world fell away. The audience, the weight of expectation, the memory of Vance's smirk. All that remained was the rhythm in her chest, now a soaring melody, ready to speak. She began her sonata, her own creation, its opening notes a delicate weave of classical structure and jazz improvisation. The music was a story, her story. The first movement sang of struggle, its minor chords echoing the nights she'd practiced on a paper keyboard, her father asleep on the couch. The second swelled with hope, arpeggios rising like the Manhattan skyline at dawn. The final movement was defiance, a fusion of blues and classical runs that danced with the spirit of her ancestors, their resilience woven into every note. Her small frame swayed, her braids swinging gently, her face alight with a joy so pure it silenced the room. The audience leaned forward, caught in the spell. A woman on the balcony wiped her eyes, her program forgotten. A man in the orchestra seats held his breath, his hands clasped tightly. Marcus sat rigid, his eyes glistening, each note a testament to the daughter he'd raised against the odds. Sister Clara nodded softly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Anaya didn't see them. She was lost in the music, her fingers flying, her heart pouring into the keys. The sonata's final chord rang out, bold and resolute, and she lifted her hands, her chest heaving, the rhythm in her heart at peace. The silence was electric, a heartbeat before the storm. Then applause erupted, a roar that shook the hall's ancient beams. The audience rose, their claps a thunderous wave, their cheers echoing Anaya's name. She stood, her legs trembling, and bowed, her ribbon glinting in the spotlight. Her eyes found her father, his tears unhidden now, his smile brighter than the stage lights. She smiled back, small but radiant, the girl who'd once been invisible now a star. As she left the stage, the rhythm in her chest hummed softly, a melody not of triumph, but of truth. She hadn't played to win, to prove, or to erase the past. She'd played to tell her story of a father's love, a community's strength, a girl's unbreakable spirit. The world had listened, not just tonight, but a year ago, in a penthouse that tried to dim her light. Talent and heart, she realized, could break through any wall, no matter how high. As she stepped into the wings, her father waiting with open arms, Anaya knew this was only the beginning. Her music, her story would sing on. Anaya's music lingered beyond Carnegie Hall, a melody that defied the walls of wealth and prejudice. Her small hands, once invisible, had woven a story that echoed through time. From a penthouse of scorn to a stage of glory, she proved that true art speaks louder than arrogance. Her rhythm, born in struggle, sang of hope, of a father's pride, of a community's strength. Anaya Washington, a girl from Harlem, showed the world that talent and heart could shatter any ceiling. Her song was not an end, but a beginning, a sonata for all who dare to dream.